Hey there, Cassandra here, the Vintage Arcade Gal. Today we're going to talk about an issue that can be kind of annoying when dealing with vintage arcade game repair, and that issue is interference. Interference can come in lots of different forms with arcade games, especially older games. A lot of the most common kinds of interference is you'll hear some white ambient noise or buzzing through the speakers of the game, and sometimes it can be very slight, and other times it can be pretty darn loud, which is obviously what you don't want. Sometimes it can take the form of actual visual interference lines on the monitor itself in either kind of a wavy pattern that goes beyond just a monitor issue, but it's actually a signal going into the monitor that's creating those problems. So there's a lot to unpack here. So what I'm basically going to go through are some general best practices. This is by no means the end-all of all list of what might be going on with your game, but it's things that I like to check that I find will solve about 85% of the interference issues that you'll probably run into with these games. Now, the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about interference is that if you've purchased a game from a vendor or warehouse, or maybe a game that's been sitting for a while or has just recently come out of service on a route, it's a good bet it's been repaired many times over in somewhat of a more haphazard way as things have gone on, and so things have gotten disconnected and those kind of things. And that's usually your first bet. I would also always recommend, if you have an arcade game, get yourself a copy of the manual, the technical manuals. Some people love to collect the original ones, like this is an original Centipede Cabaret one from Atari in the early 80s. But the great thing about the internet is most of the manuals are available online in the form of PDF, so if you don't feel like printing them out or don't feel like searching eBay for the originals, you can still have that information. And some manuals are better than others. The Atari ones usually come with supplements and technical diagrams, which are pretty helpful in these kind of situations. So let's take a look at just some best practices to maybe at least minimize the possibility of interference in your classic arcade game. So this Rally X I've been working on recently has a pretty classic interference issue. It's making some kind of buzzy noises, and it's also interfering with the screen itself, having some lines that are pretty predominant, wavy back and forth, and it's kind of annoying. So it's really the last thing I need to do to fix this game. So we're going to go over some things together and kind of see if we can solve it. Okay, so we're going to assume just a couple of things before we kind of dive into this. The first thing we're going to assume is that your monitor is fully working and there are no problems with your monitor. It's been recapped, maybe you have a recent flyback on there and you have new HOTS. If you have questions about this procedure, I do have a video you can watch where we kind of recap a G07 Electro Home monitor to give you an idea how to do that. So we're just going to assume that the problem is not with your monitor. An easy way to check that is while the game is turned off, go inside the back and unplug the power to the monitor internally, turn the game on, and if you still hear the interference, well then obviously it's not the monitor because the monitor isn't getting any power. The other thing we're going to assume here is that all your ground wires to your power supply, all the power connectors to the power supply are correctly connected. That your grounds that maybe were disconnected by a manufacturer have been reconnected, or they were disconnected by a distributor. The grounds inside the game, which often get disconnected over time. If you have changed to a switching power supply, which a lot of people do with these games, we're going to assume that it's all hooked up correctly and that your voltage to the game is also correct using a multimeter. Most of these games require 5 volts. You go a little lower, a little higher than that is usually okay, but if you go too far out of the range, you can run into some problems, including interference if it's running too hot. So we're just going to assume those things are correct. If not, go back and check those things. So if you unplug the monitor and turn the game back on with the monitor unplugged internally, and the interference is gone, but you can hear the game playing blind, then it's going to be a problem with your monitor and not something else. Okay, let's go real quick, and we're going to look at a power supply real quick. Here we have a power supply inside an Atari game. Now, this power supply was used by Atari for many years. This is not indicative of all power supplies, but I'll tell you two classic power supplies from arcade games you're going to want to rebuild and not replace. The first one is an Atari power supply. They are just bulletproof and require very little work to get going again. The second ones I like to rebuild are actually the ones in Williams games, which I also find very reliable and rewarding to rebuild. Other games, such as like Tato games, that have pretty well-known, unreliable power supplies, go ahead and put a new modern switching power supply in there. You'll probably be much better off. Now, one of the things you're going to want in an Atari game to redo is this guy. This is called a Big Blue. Now, notice that's not blue. The modern versions of them are not blue, but originally they look like these big, humongous capacitors. Got to be careful around these, but you want to replace these, even though a lot of people swear they never die. I've found some interesting issues that have come up with bad ones, the game operating strangely, and if you're going to go ahead and go to the trouble of rebuilding the monitor and the other things like, you know, your other boards here, you might as well go ahead and replace the Big Blue. They're like $10, $15. You know, and again, I always like to label them to show when I changed it. The other thing, a best practice for all power supplies is with the power turned off now, when we look at the fuses in these power supplies, a lot of times the fuse holders will get very dirty and nasty and sometimes broken or oxidized. So what I like to do is, first of all, I'll replace all the fuses with the correct fuse, of course, the right amperage and the right voltage, and if it's a slow blow or a quick blow fuse or just a regular blow fuse, all new fuses, because they do get oxidized on the ends, and even though the fuse may technically work, the connection can cause sorts of problems. And then you want to clean the holders out. Sometimes you have to replace them if they're too oxidized or rusty. You can use an eraser to a new pencil, or you can also get real fancy and get some emery cloth, and it's just like some sandpaper kind of material to help get rid of the oxidation and the rust on these to ensure we have a very clean connection. And the other thing is, I always like to say, is clean out the bottom of your games, clean out the power supply, make sure you don't have any weird wires, that everything is very well connected in there. You know, make sure all your grounds are properly connected, that these posts that the grounds go into are not completely rusted or corroded. That can also cause issues. That's just a good best practice. I mean, anything with a fuse, if it's an older fuse and it looks like it's oxidized, go ahead and clean it out with emery cloth. Go ahead and put a new fuse in there. You know, spend the 25 cents and put a new fuse in there. So let's talk about one of the most obvious things you can talk about, which is actually just the plug that goes into the games. Easy to replace. This one's in pretty good shape, but a lot of times when you get these from warehouses or vendors where it's been sitting around for a while, this third ground will be cut, which is not a good idea, or they may just be in disrepair and frayed, rusted, those kind of things. Buy yourself a new $8 plug, put it in your game. That has solved a number of problems for myself over the years. I guess they cut these sometimes just because of where the games are. I used to get a lot of games from North Carolina, and they were always cut. Don't really understand. Maybe they just fall off. But anyway, get yourself a new plug. That will help some interference issues. Coming from your power cable into the game, it's a good bet. The first thing you're going to find is one of these. And this is a filter. It's a tiny little piece of metal that filters from the power line coming into the game from the wall to the game itself, and generally it goes to either some sort of fuse relay and eventually it will go to your isolation transformer. These things fail fairly often. They get tired and old. They're very inexpensive and very easy to change out. They cost maybe like 10 bucks, take about 10-15 minutes to change one. This is usually the first thing I tend to change when I feel like there may be an issue with interference, just because it's kind of an easy thing to fix. It's just a good best practice, especially if you're changing the power cable. Speaking of isolation transformers, I don't know if we were or not. Were we? Yeah, I think we were. Anyway, these things also have a tendency to cause problems with interference, either because they're incorrectly hooked up, some knucklehead has bypassed them, and you never want to bypass one of these. It can be very dangerous. I have run into an issue or two, though, where it was causing direct interference to the monitor. Just I don't know if it was going bad or what, but another inexpensive, easy thing to fix or replace. Also, just make sure that it's connected properly with nice, good solder, nice, clean connection, and it's properly grounded and going where it should be going as far as the chain of wiring goes. On a lot of games from the late 70s to the early 80s, what you find are one of these. And these are what they refer to as filter boards. Now, these were originally designed as an FCC requirement so the games would not interfere with the old school CB radios that truckers and I guess taxi drivers use, or they used to use anyway. The best thing to do with one of these is to throw it away. They're notoriously unreliable. They don't really do anything for you. And even though there are some people who still swear by these, you find that 95% of them no longer work and they solve very few problems. They actually usually create more problems than anything. So if you, for some reason, still have one of these, especially on a Bally Midway game, even some of the later Atari games, go ahead and take it off. That might actually solve your problem right from the get-go. Okay, so here's the most dramatic angle I've come up with yet. We're inside the game, actually, and we have our main CPU to our Crystal Castles game. And this edge connector, these also get very dirty and can cause all sorts of interference issues, especially if someone has repaired it. This one's pretty cherry, but you know, if you best practice, get your emery cloth out again, and you want to carefully clean both sides, because there's two sides to these boards, no matter how many inputs you have. The other thing you run into sometimes is your interface here, your pin edge connector. These can get bent and frayed and broken, and that can also cause interference. Sometimes operators will clip certain wires for whatever reason or bad repairs, and you have to put a new edge connector on there, which can cause, you know, your problems sometimes to go away. You also just want to make sure these things are very securely in there. One of my big pet peeves I have on a Mini is these things should be securely put down. Like this one, I have the screw out now. Go ahead and put that screw back in there when you're finished repairing it. Otherwise, it's just gonna move around when the game moves around, and you're gonna run into problems later on. But clean edges, check your wires on the board, and that goes for all boards, all connectors. Everything should have a nice clean connection. All your ground should be attached, and you need to make sure the voltages are correct, of course, making sure that that 5 volt is not kind of wiggly or rubbing against maybe the video or something that can cause sorts of weird problems and interference as well. Let's take one more look at a different board for some other issues you may have for interference. Okay, right now we have an extreme close-up part of the audio section of this Rally X board, the one I'm actually having trouble with right now. And a couple things you want to check while you're looking at interference issues, especially regarding audio interference, which in turn can also create video interference. Check your pot. This is the volume pot that controls how loud or how soft the sound is. If they sound scratchy, or if you touch them, you get a lot of noise or interference, go ahead and change it. You need to make sure you change it with the same ohmage as the one that you had. That way you still have as much control as possible. The other thing you check a lot of times in these audio sections are these, you have a regular caps, which I've already changed, are these kind of little button disc caps as well. They're very inexpensive to change. They can cause all sorts of problems too. They can dry out I've noticed with some of these, and I think actually one of these is a culprit, because if you hold it down when the game is turned on, it makes all sorts of noise. Not the most scientific approach ever, but a lot of times if you push on these chips and you get one that you feel is a little hotter than it should be, or it makes that kind of feedback noise, that could be the issue. Any of these resistors also too could be part of the problem. You also have amp circuits like these that get old and toned out. This is an IC down here that controls part of the amplifier as well. That could be part of the problem as well. We're not going to go too much into board repair here, but the pod is a good idea to replace, especially if it's original. And any of these caps, especially in the audio section, are usually a good idea if you can't quite diagnose the problem at this point. Going a little bit further down the rabbit hole with the CPUs themselves, things to check. Just like monitors have capacitors, your main CPU boards are also going to have all sorts of capacitors. Some boards have more than any. Like this is a Donkey Kong Jr. board, and it's just littered with all sorts of little capacitors all over the place. And yeah, they can cause interference and other problems as well. And even though this is a lot of work to replace these, I've run into some problems where just simple capacitors have solved interference problems in the past, or at least toned it down, at least to the point where it's acceptable. The other thing to keep in mind with capacitors is these are not the only capacitors that you run into, these style of capacitors. A lot of times if you're running into the more flat and kind of ceramic caps, or the what they call button capacitors, those can also create problems. You can check with a multimeter to see if a capacitor is working, but that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, because it may have lost just enough impedance to cause a problem, a chain reaction, especially around the audio area of the board. The other thing you also want to do, and this is going to be one of those like next level kind of tech things, is you can carefully remove the chips that are removable and clean them again. Clean the leg pins very carefully with your emery cloth or another tool and carefully reset them. Resetting chips and cleaning chips is actually a really good way to see if you can get a board working, especially if you have a RAM or a ROM error. It usually fixes a lot of issues. The chips get oxidized, they get dirty. Sometimes they don't quite fit in the sockets any longer. You just have to be very careful with removing these chips. I like to use a chip puller or a very small flathead screwdriver to do it. Okay, so now when you remove chips to clean them, best practice is use either one of these chip pullers. I don't really like these kind of things. I've got a whole bunch of different ones. This one's actually for a slightly larger chip than these, but I don't ever feel like I have control over pulling the chips out. So I just use a very small, tiny flathead screwdriver. You have to be very slow and very patient and very cautious to do this, because you don't want to bend the pins, and you definitely don't want to cause any sort of damage to either the chip or the board. Now, so we have this Donkey Kong Jr. board, which is in pretty bad repair. It's actually missing some chips, but what you can do is you just take your flathead and go very carefully in between where the chip and the chip holder is, and you stick it under there a little bit and just kind of move it left to right and just kind of walk it. And then what I like to do, and then is just go to the other side, get a better angle here, and do the same thing. Again, it's not a race. Take your time. You don't want to damage the chip. So just move very, very, very gentle. Oh, here it comes. You don't want to ever force these things. There, and now it's off. And then what we would do is you would take your emery cloth and gently just clean these legs as best as you can. These look pretty darn clean. This is a dead board, by the way. And just carefully clean them. And then when you go to reset it, just very, very carefully make sure all your pins are straight. Sometimes if they get a little bent, you just want to carefully straighten them back up as best you can. And then you set it back into the holes, making sure it's aligned. and just kind of walking it back down there. Don't ever force anything. And there you go. And that will not only solve maybe your interference problems, but maybe some RAM or ROM issues. It would probably be rare that this would fix an interference issue, but it might fix some other things as a best practice. Behind our marquee in our game, we're going to find all sorts of things that can cause some interference issues that are very easily fixed. So if we take our marquee off, what we find, and you'll find in most games, is a fluorescent light bulb or fixture of some kind. And sometimes the speakers of the game will also be up here, and usually that's about it. Fluorescent light bulb, obviously, get yourself a new one. If it's an older one, make sure your connectors are clean. If it's a more of a traditional kind of in and out kind, the Riley X one's a little primitive, it just kind of plugs in. Just make sure all your prongs are still there. Make sure that they're not broken, make sure they're clean them off with your emery cloth. Starters cause a lot of problems. Just pick yourself up a new one if you're kind of redoing a game. These are very inexpensive, they're like $1. Just make sure it's the right kind, the numbers are all on there to tell you what kind it is. You don't want to put the wrong kind of starter in there, it can cause problems or just not work, or worse, destroy something. You know, your power source, whatever your power source happens to be that comes from the power supply that regulates it, those two, make sure that the wires are clean, it's grounded. You know, you may have to replace that as well. A real easy way to tell, you know, obviously if it's causing problems, just with the game turned off, unplug the fluorescent fixture. Sometimes they have a fast release in the back. Turn the game back on, and if it's unplugged, but the game is still working and the interference goes away, obviously it's the fluorescent fixture. Some people replace these with an LED or a newer fluorescent fixture. I don't really have a problem replacing them. If you're going to be super button counter kind of person with restoration, you want to restore it, go for it. You know, the parts are usually pretty easily available. There's not a lot to these things. The other thing I want to point out is just speakers. Like, some speakers will actually have a little capacitor on them that you may want to fix, and you just want to make sure the wires are good. I have never really had a speaker go bad unless it was waterlogged. You do want to make sure it's connected correctly. Positive and negative makes a difference on a speaker. Sometimes they get switched around by questionable technician people, so you know, check on that as well. There's no harm in replacing the speaker if you really want to, but you know, most video games before 1985, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, the quality of the speaker. If the speaker works, it works. You know, Donkey Kong is not going to sound any better by putting a Bose speaker in it. It's just, it kind of is what it is. Don't send me letters if you disagree, but you know, it's speakers are speakers. That they work, they work. It's a giant magnet with a piece of paper. There's not a lot of audio fidelity with most of these early games. But anyway, I find the fluorescent fixtures tend to be a big source for interference over the years, and pretty easy to fix. Now, most of these games that we have now in our collection are approaching 40 years old, and some of them originally had kind of these strong metal cages that would prevent interference, and a lot of times, unfortunately, they're just gone. They were removed by operators. But the one set of games you want to make sure you have those cages are actually vector games. The monitors usually have a metal cage around the high voltage section of the monitor where the flyback is, and if that's missing, that can actually create a lot of interference, especially with the Wells Gardner 6100 color vector monitor found in games like Tempest or Star Wars. So if you don't have one on yours or it's missing, you may want to think about getting a reproduction from some people on eBay or try to find an old one, because those are kind of critical and they can create all sorts of problems that they are missing. So there you go. There are some best approaches or best tips to try to track down some very simple interference issues you may be dealing with your arcade games. Obviously not the end-all to end-all of lists. Dealing with this interference can be kind of a difficult problem sometimes to track down, and a little frustrating since it kind of detracts from the enjoyment of the game. But I would recommend, if you do run into some severe interference with your game, don't play it out to see if something fails bigger. I would go ahead and try to track it down immediately. It's kind of like if someone is ill, you don't want to just let it linger on until their arm falls off or something. You know, you go ahead and pull the game from operation and see if you can track down the issue. And of course, the internet is full of ideas, and there's lots of professional repair services if you get in a little bit over your head with board repair, which I honestly often do. Board repair is not really my forte. So hopefully that helped. Be careful out there, especially when you're working around electricity. Make sure the game is always turned off if you're pulling something out. I always like to make sure it's unplugged as well. Some of these things, of course, have a residual charge, especially flybacks with monitors, so be very, very careful. Hopefully that helped. Thanks for watching my video, and I'll have some more videos coming up soon, just depending upon how my school schedule goes. Bye.